The dusty air in the museum's oldest wing felt like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Rows of sagging shelves bowed under the weight of forgotten history, their contents entombed in shadows and cobwebs. Daniel Mercer, the quiet archivist who had worked here for 15 years, moved like a shadow himself, brushing dust from labels and setting aside pieces for cataloguing. He wasn't the kind of man anyone noticed in the busy main galleries. While others handled glamorous exhibitions, Daniel was assigned to the basement, where time stood still and treasures waited in silence. On a rainy afternoon, when thunder rattled the windows above, Daniel's gloved fingers brushed against something cylindrical, wedged deep behind a stack of water-stained ledgers. The object was cool to the touch, heavier than it appeared, and sealed with a band of ancient wax. His breath caught. This wasn't the kind of container used for the museum's modern acquisitions. He carried it to his small desk beneath a flickering bulb. The wax bore an unfamiliar emblem, a sun with an eye at its center, surrounded by concentric circles. It felt older than anything he had ever handled. Part of him wanted to log it into the system and pass it along to the curators. The other part, a restless curiosity he had nurtured since childhood, whispered to see what was inside. Daniel thought of his grandfather, a merchant sailor, who once told him, "Some finds change the finder, boy, and not always for the better." He hesitated, the words lingering in his mind. Still his fingers worked at the brittle seal, prying until it cracked with a sound like old bone. Inside was a tightly rolled parchment, the edges frayed, but the core miraculously intact. As he eased it open, a faint smell of desert dust rose, as if it had been trapped for centuries. His eyes widened at the first glimpse, intricate ink lines, faded but still vivid enough to depict a topography he didn't recognize. There were mountains, rivers, and, at the center, a city drawn in impossible detail. Stranger still were the markings in ancient Egyptian script. He had seen reproductions in books, but this writing felt different, denser, more urgent, as though whoever wrote it had been trying to record something forbidden before it was lost forever. And then he noticed them. Black ink sigils scrawled along the border, sharp and alien. Unlike any hieroglyphs he knew. The archivist leaned closer, tracing the routes marked on the map with a trembling finger. One path was marked with a symbol he recognized from a fragment he had once restored, a warning sign meaning not to be spoken. That fragment had been part of a funerary text, and now here it was again, in a map pointing to a city he had never heard of. A sudden creak behind him made him flinch. The janitor, an older man with knowing eyes, stood at the doorway. "You shouldn't be down here after hours, Daniel," he said, voice low, almost wary. His gaze fell on the parchment, and for a moment his expression changed, recognition, then something like fear. Without another word, he turned away and disappeared into the dim corridor. Daniel sat frozen. That fleeting look had spoken volumes. This map was not just rare, it was dangerous. Yet the pull it exerted on him was stronger than any sense of caution. He thought of the endless days of quiet work, the endless shelves of unremarkable records, and now, here in his hands, was a secret begging to be uncovered. He carefully rolled the parchment back into its container, sealing it in a protective wrap. His pulse was racing, a strange exhilaration rising in his chest. Somewhere deep in the sands of Egypt, a city forgotten by history was waiting, and now he knew the way. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Dr. Hassan's life. Daniel locked the basement door behind him that night, the tube tucked under his arm. He had no idea yet that the discovery would drag him from the safety of the archives into the heart of a desert older than empires, where secrets had been buried for a reason. And the sand, as always, was patient. Daniel didn't sleep that night. The image of the map hovered in his mind like an afterimage burned onto his vision. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the concentric circles around the sun-eye emblem and the angular black sigils biting into the parchment's edges. He told himself it was just an artifact, nothing more, yet deep down he knew the truth. Objects like this weren't misplaced, they were hidden. The next morning, he brought the tube back to his cramped apartment. His kitchen table became an improvised workspace, scattered with magnifying glasses, reference books, and photocopied pages from his own private collection. He took meticulous notes, translating what he could from the ancient Egyptian script. The words were clipped, urgent. City erased, guardians, curse of the hollow sun. Daniel frowned. Curses were the realm of folklore, but the phrasing was deliberate and paired with precise geographical indicators that hinted the writer had been no mere storyteller. He noticed the cartographer had drawn a specific pathway through the desert, avoiding certain regions entirely. Small sketches of jackal-headed figures and horned birds flanked the detour points. By midday, Daniel knew he needed an expert. He contacted Dr. Salim Hassan, a retired Egyptologist who occasionally volunteered at the museum's education program. Hassan answered after the third ring, his voice warm but curious. "Mr. Mercer, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Daniel hesitated before explaining. "I found something in the archives. It's a map. Old, possibly 18th dynasty, maybe older. It's unusual." There was a pause on the other end. "Bring it to my home, and Daniel, handle it with extreme care." Hassan's apartment was small but overflowing with books, manuscripts, and artifacts that looked like they belonged in glass cases. When Daniel unrolled the parchment across Hassan's desk, the scholar's eyes widened. He didn't speak for nearly a full minute, only tracing the ink lines with a fingertip, his brow furrowing deeper and deeper. "Where did you find this?" Hassan finally asked, his tone stripped of casual warmth. "In the museum's basement, behind some ledgers. No record of it in the inventory," Daniel replied. Hassan leaned back, his gaze fixed on the map as though it might leap from the table. "This is no ordinary map. It refers to a place the ancients called Irem Sutek, the city of the fallen sun. According to the old texts, it was purged from history under royal decree. The priests claimed it had angered the gods. Every record was destroyed, every stone dismantled, every survivor silenced." Daniel's mouth went dry. "But why?" "No one knows for certain," Hassan said quietly. "Some say it was a city of heretics who rejected the pharaohs. Others, that it held knowledge too dangerous to exist." He tapped one of the black sigils. "And these? They're not Egyptian. They're older, much older. This," he looked up sharply, "is not a place you seek out, Daniel. This is a place you avoid." For a moment, Daniel considered handing over the map and walking away. He imagined returning to his quiet routines, shelving books in the dim archives. But the thought of abandoning the mystery gnawed at him. "If this city is real," he asked slowly, "wouldn't finding it change everything we know about Egyptian history?" Hassan's eyes darkened. "Some truths come with a price too high to pay." Daniel left with the map carefully wrapped, Hassan's warning echoing in his ears. That night, as rain pattered against his window, he unfolded it again. His gaze followed the marked route like a lifeline into the unknown. The lines seemed to call to him as though they were waiting for someone stubborn enough or foolish enough to follow them. He knew then that the decision had already been made. Somewhere beneath the shifting sands, Irem Sutek was waiting, and Daniel intended to find it. 2 weeks later, Daniel stood at the edge of a small cafe in Cairo, the scent of spiced tea and roasted lamb hanging in the warm evening air. The city roared with life, vendors calling out prices, children weaving through crowds, the hum of traffic blending with the distant call to prayer. Yet Daniel felt strangely alone, a man carrying a secret heavier than his suitcase. He had left without telling anyone at the museum. His official vacation request was vague. Personal matters. The only one who knew where he was headed was Dr. Hassan, and even he had shaken his head in resignation when Daniel boarded the plane. Hassan's parting words had been firm. "If you go alone. Don't involve me." Daniel had spent the last few days gathering supplies, maps, a compass, a satellite phone, a week's worth of water, and enough food to last him through the desert stretch marked on the ancient parchment. The map itself never left his sight. He kept it tucked in a waterproof case inside his backpack, wrapped in linen, as though the extra layer could shield it from more than just sand and heat. In the cafe, an older man with weathered skin and eyes sharp as flint slid into the seat across from him. This was Youssef, a guide recommended by one of Hassan's old contacts. "You seek the western sands," Youssef said without preamble, his accent thick but clear. "Few go there without reason, fewer return." Daniel studied him. "I have a map." Youssef's lips curled in a half-smile. "Everyone who comes to me has a map. Most of them lead to empty dunes." "This one's different." Daniel slid the protective tube a few inches across the table, but didn't open it. "It's older than any map you've seen." The guide's gaze lingered on the container, then on Daniel's steady expression. Finally, he nodded. 3 days' journey to the coordinates you seek. We leave at dawn, bring strong boots and stronger resolve. The next morning, the city faded into a blur of minarets and dust as they set out in an old land cruiser. The desert soon swallowed everything. No roads, no landmarks, only the endless roll of golden dunes under a merciless sky. The heat pressed down like a weight, shimmering in the air above the sand. At night, the temperature dropped sharply. They camped beneath a canopy of stars so dense it felt like the sky itself was leaning closer. Youssef built a small fire and brewed tea, his eyes fixed on the flames. "There are stories," he said softly, "about a place where the wind never touches the sand, where shadows move without light. My grandfather told me it is cursed ground." Daniel sipped his tea, the warmth chasing away the desert chill. "What do you believe?" Youssef didn't answer immediately. "I believe some places guard themselves, and some men can't take a hint." On the third day, the dunes shifted. The wind carried a strange scent, dry, metallic, almost like the air before a lightning storm. Daniel unrolled the map under the shade of the land cruiser, his heart racing as he compared the inked route to the horizon. The landmarks matched, a jagged ridge to the north, a hollow in the sand shaped like a crescent moon. They were close. By late afternoon, Youssef slowed the vehicle to a crawl. Ahead, the desert dipped into a shallow basin. From its center jutted 3 massive stone pillars, half buried and weathered by centuries. Their surfaces were carved with the same black sigils Daniel had seen on the map. "This is as far as I go," Youssef said, cutting the engine. "Beyond those stones you are alone." Daniel stared at the pillars, a shiver running through him despite the heat. He tightened the straps on his backpack and stepped into the basin. The sand felt strangely cool beneath his boots, as though it hadn't seen the sun in years. He didn't look back. Daniel's breath came in shallow bursts as he passed between the three stone pillars. The desert sound, a constant hiss of wind, seemed to vanish the moment he crossed their shadow. The silence was so complete it pressed against his eardrums, and the air carried that same metallic tang he had noticed earlier. Stronger now, almost oppressive. Beyond the pillars, the terrain shifted abruptly. The dunes were smoother here, as if sculpted by an unseen hand. The sand was darker too, a muted bronze that seemed to swallow the light rather than reflect it. His boots left shallow prints, and when he bent to touch the surface, it felt strangely firm, like a crust hiding something beneath. The map directed him toward a line of low ridges to the west. As he walked, the temperature seemed to drop, not enough to be cold, but enough to raise goosebumps on his forearms. Shadows clung to the ridges in unnatural shapes, refusing to shift even as the sun drifted across the sky. He paused to check his compass. The needle trembled violently. Unable to settle, he stuffed it back into his pocket, relying solely on the hand-drawn coordinates now. After an hour, Daniel reached the base of the ridges, a narrow pass cut through the stone, its walls etched with deep carvings. He recognized some symbols, ankhs, scarabs, falcons, but others were completely alien, spiraling patterns that drew his gaze inward until his vision blurred. The carvings looked fresh, as though the stonecutters had only just put down their tools. A movement in the corner of his eye made him spin. Nothing. Only the empty pass and the strange shadows on the walls. He took a steadying breath and pushed on. The pass opened into a hidden valley, and Daniel froze. Before him lay a stretch of desert unlike any he had seen. Towering statues stood in a semicircle, each one depicting a figure with the head of an animal, jackal, ibis, lion, crocodile, yet their bodies were armored in segmented plates, nothing like the robes of traditional Egyptian deities. The sand here was piled in deliberate mounds, each crowned with fragments of stone or bronze. Daniel approached the nearest statue, brushing away the grit clinging to its base. Beneath the layers of sand, the pedestal was engraved with an inscription. He traced it slowly, translating in a whisper, "Here stand the watchers of Iram Sutech. None may pass who carry the sun's shadow." The words made little sense, yet a cold certainty settled in his stomach. This place wasn't meant to be found. The statues weren't markers, they were sentinels. As he moved deeper into the valley, Daniel felt the air thicken as though each step dragged him into a place outside the reach of time. The map's path curved sharply toward a ridge at the far end, where a narrow cave mouth yawned like a waiting jaw. Above it, the black sigils were carved again, larger this time, their sharp angles catching the last light of the day. He hesitated. The stories Hassan and Youssef had told him flickered through his mind, each one ending in ruin for the seeker. But the weight of the map in his pack, the weeks of preparation, and the gnawing need to know pushed him forward. Daniel ducked into the cave. The air was cooler, tinged with the scent of old stone and something faintly sweet like dried lotus. His flashlight beams swept across the walls, revealing more of the spiraling carvings. The ground sloped gently downward, the sand giving way to smooth stone tiles. Then, at the edge of his light, something gleamed, a fragment of gold leaf, clinging stubbornly to a carved panel. Daniel stepped closer, and the beam revealed a mural, an immense, sprawling city rendered in exquisite detail. Towers of white limestone, canals reflecting sunlight, market squares teeming with life. Beneath the image, a single line of text. "The city that defied the sun shall sleep until the shadow is lifted." Daniel's heart pounded. This was it. Proof. The first undeniable evidence that Irem Sutek had been real. But as he traced the mural with his light, he realized something unsettling. Every figure in the painted streets had their faces obscured, smeared into featureless shapes, and behind the city's walls, painted in black, a massive shape loomed, watching. Daniel's pulse thudded in his ears as he stepped deeper into the cave, the mural lingering in his mind like a warning he couldn't quite decode. The painted city seemed alive in the flashlight's beam, the black mass beyond its walls pulsing in his imagination. He forced himself to look away and pressed forward, the slope steepening beneath his boots. The air grew cooler still, and a faint breeze whispered from somewhere far ahead, unnerving because he couldn't see any exit. His light caught on fragments of worked stone half buried in the sand, a broken amphora painted with lotus petals, the corner of a tablet carved with the head of a falcon. Each piece felt like a heartbeat from another age, discarded and left to moulder in this forgotten throat of the earth. The passage opened abruptly into a vast hollow. Daniel's breath caught. Before him lay a valley hidden beneath the desert floor, an entire city sunken into the earth. Towering pylons rose from the sand like skeletal fingers. Obelisks, half-toppled, jutted from plazas paved in cracked stone. Faint traces of pigment clung to the walls, hinting at colors that must once have dazzled under the sun. And yet, no sunlight touched this place. The light that reached it was dim, refracted through slits in the stone ceiling far above, as though the desert itself was hiding the city from the sky. Daniel descended a crumbling stairway, every step echoing into the stillness. The streets were eerily intact, their layout precise, like a city built to some sacred geometry. But the silence here was different from the desert's. This silence felt listening. He passed doorways blocked with stone slabs, each marked with the black sigils from the map. His fingers itched to push one open, but some instinct, primal and absolute, warned him not to disturb whatever lay behind. In the city's heart stood a ziggurat-like temple, its steps lined with statues of kneeling figures whose faces had been chiseled away. Daniel's light caught on something glimmering halfway up the stairs, an inlaid strip of gold, remarkably untouched by time. Climbing, he noticed more details, scratches along the stone, as if something massive had dragged itself toward the temple doors. At the top, twin pillars framed an entrance tall enough for 3 men to stand on each other's shoulders. Above the lintel, an inscription in the old Egyptian tongue read, "We hid the truth in shadow, for the light would destroy it." The phrase prickled the back of his neck. His hand tightened on the flashlight as he stepped into the temple. The interior was cool, the air heavy with the scent of dust and minerals. Niches lined the walls, each holding a carved chest sealed with black pitch. At the far end, an altar stood on a raised dais, flanked by statues of the same armored animal-headed figures he had seen outside. Resting atop the altar was a stone coffer etched with spiraling designs. Daniel's breath hitched as he approached. The lid bore no lock, only a shallow indentation shaped like a human hand. His fingers hovered over it, trembling. Every instinct screamed to stop. But he thought of the map, the long journey, the years spent in anonymity while others uncovered the past. Slowly, he pressed his palm into the indentation. There was a faint click. The lid shifted, releasing a whisper of air so cold it burned. He eased it open. Inside lay a collection of artifacts, a dagger with a blade of blackened glass, a necklace strung with opals that glowed faintly in the dim light, and a scroll sealed with the sun eye emblem from the tube. His pulse raced as he lifted the scroll. It felt warm, almost alive in his hands. A shiver ran down his spine. Somewhere behind him, in the silent temple, a shadow shifted against the wall, though there was no light to cast it. Daniel froze, his breath caught in his throat. The shadow was wrong. Too tall, too still, its edges blurred like smoke. He turned slowly, but the far wall of the temple stood bare, the statues as silent and unmoving as before. The air, however, felt heavier now, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. He swallowed hard and looked back to the coffer. The scroll in his grip seemed to hum faintly, as if resonating with something in the stone around him. He slid it carefully into his pack, the weight of it somehow greater than its size could explain. A faint sound broke the silence, a scraping, rhythmic and slow, from somewhere deep within the temple. It came again, closer, like stone sliding over stone. Daniel's instinct screamed for him to leave, but his eyes caught on a mural behind the altar, half hidden in shadow. He stepped closer, raising his flashlight. And the mural depicted the same city from the cave entrance, but now it was aflame. Black shapes rose from the streets, towering forms with twisted limbs, faceless heads turned toward the sky. In the foreground, priests bowed before a figure holding a staff topped with the sun eye emblem, its rays black instead of gold. Beneath the image, the inscription read, "When the sun turns hollow, the city shall be swallowed." The scraping sound grew louder, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Frost edged the corners of the altar. Daniel's breath became visible, curling in pale clouds. He turned toward the temple entrance, but the space between the twin pillars seemed darker now, the light from outside reduced to a thin, trembling thread. A sudden gust extinguished his flashlight. Panic flared in his chest. He fumbled for the spare battery, hands shaking, the darkness feeling far too alive. When the beam returned, it illuminated something that hadn't been there before. Fresh footprints in the dust, leading from the altar toward the entrance. Bare, human-like, but each toe elongated, ending in sharp impressions like claws. Daniel's throat went dry. He followed the prints to the doorway, but they simply ended as if the owner had stepped into the air and vanished. The silence returned, deeper than before. It was then he realized that the temple no longer smelled of dust and minerals. It smelled faintly of smoke, as though from ancient fires that had never gone out. He needed to leave. Now! Descending the temple steps, Daniel cast one last glance over the city below. Something about it had changed. The obelisk seemed taller, the shadows thicker. In the streets, the sand appeared disturbed, forming winding paths where before it had been smooth. He hurried back toward the ridge, his boots crunching in the eerie quiet. Each time he looked over his shoulder, he half expected to see one of the armored statues stepping down from its pedestal. At the mouth of the cave, Daniel paused to take one last look back. The hidden city lay shrouded in stillness again, as if nothing had stirred. Yet he knew, with a certainty that made his skin crawl, that he had woken something, or at least that something now knew he was there. Clutching his pack, he turned and began the long trek back to the desert basin, the coiled map burning like a brand against his side. The sun was sinking low when Daniel emerged from the ridge into the open basin. The 3 stone pillars loomed ahead, their weathered faces catching the orange light like silent judges. He quickened his pace, eager to put distance between himself and the city buried behind him. But as he drew nearer, the air seemed to resist his movements, each step heavier, as though the sand clung to his boots. A faint vibration thrummed through the ground, travelling up his legs into his chest. He paused, scanning the horizon, but the desert lay still in every direction. Yusef's land cruiser was gone. Daniel's stomach dropped. Tracks in the sand marked where the vehicle had been, leading away toward the west. Whether Yusef had left in fear, impatience, or something else, Daniel couldn't guess. All he knew was that the desert night would soon close in. He pushed forward, passing between the stone pillars. Immediately, the oppressive silence of the inner valley lifted, replaced by the low sigh of the wind. But there was something else now, an almost inaudible whisper threading through the gusts. It was in no language Daniel recognized, yet the cadence made his skin crawl. By the time he reached the crest of a dune, the last light had faded, and the desert was a sheet of cold silver under the rising moon. Daniel set his pack down and unrolled the map, angling it so the moonlight illuminated the ink. His breath caught. The map had changed. The once faded lines were sharper now, as if freshly drawn. And there, on the parchment's edge, was a new symbol, 3 vertical slashes inside a circle. It wasn't Egyptian. In fact, it matched one of the black sigils carved into the city's statues. A sudden chill wind snapped the map from his hands. It tumbled down the slope, unfurling across the sand. Daniel scrambled after it, but as he reached for the parchment, the wind died abruptly, the air unnaturally still. He retrieved the map, clutching it to his chest, and in that silence he became aware of movement nearby. Shadows shifted at the base of the dune, tall, thin shapes just beyond the edge of clear sight. They didn't advance, but their stillness was worse than if they had. Daniel's breath quickened. He turned and began moving west, his boots crunching steadily over the sand, refusing to look back. Hours passed. The moon arced high, and the desert night grew colder. At last, Daniel spotted the faint outline of a structure, a lone stone building, likely an abandoned outpost. Inside, he found a broken cot, a clay jar with stale water, and the remains of a fire pit. He sank to the floor, exhaustion pressing in. Pulling the scroll from his pack, he hesitated before breaking the seal. Every part of him screamed that it would be a mistake, but his fingers moved anyway, peeling away the brittle wax. The parchment inside was unlike the map, its ink deep red, the characters precise. Though he couldn't read it fully, he recognized certain words from Hassan's lessons: sun, shadow, gate. Near the bottom, a crude depiction of the city appeared, surrounded by the same 3 vertical slashes now on his map. Daniel set it down, his mind racing. Whatever this was, it wasn't simply an archaeological find. It was a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Outside, the whispering rose again, threading through the cracks in the stone walls. This time, Daniel was certain it was closer. 3 months later, the museum's grand rotunda buzzed with the muted conversations of tourists and scholars. Daniel stood at the edge of the main hall, watching as visitors passed beneath a new exhibit banner, echoes of the desert, artifacts from the forgotten sands. He had returned from Egypt gaunt, sunburned, and haunted by nights he could barely remember. Yusef was never found. His absence was explained away as a misunderstanding in the expedition's records, though Daniel knew better. He had left the guide's name out of every report, along with certain details that no one would believe. On display in a glass case lay the scroll, now carefully mounted and illuminated. The curators praised it as a previously unknown religious text of the late New Kingdom, but Daniel had said nothing about the city it described. or the changes he had seen in the map. In private moments, he would take the map from its locked drawer in the archives. It no longer looked as it had in the desert. The ink was pale again, the strange sigil gone. Yet sometimes, when the room was quiet and the light fell just so, he could swear he saw faint outlines of new paths, curving into places the parchment had not shown before. Hassan visited once, walking the exhibit with slow, deliberate steps. At the scroll's case he paused, studying it for a long while before glancing at Daniel. "You brought something back with you," he said softly, not as a question, but as a fact. Daniel didn't answer. That night, in his small apartment, he woke to the sound of sand shifting somewhere inside. The floor was clean, but a thin line of bronze-colored dust trailed from his window to the desk where the map was locked away. The air was cool, tinged with that same metallic scent from the basin. He sat in the dark until dawn, the key to the desk clutched in his hand, wrestling with the knowledge that opening it might mean seeing more, or inviting more. Weeks passed. The museum exhibit drew international attention, yet Daniel kept to his routine, cataloguing shipments and restoring artifacts in the basement. He avoided the rotunda whenever possible, but on certain days, when the air felt heavy and the shadows stretched longer than they should, he would catch himself glancing toward the locked drawer, wondering if the paths had changed again. One evening, long after closing, Daniel walked the empty halls. In the rotunda, moonlight spilled across the scroll's case. For a moment, the glass reflected not his own face, but a skyline of pale stone towers under a black sun. He stepped back, heart pounding, and the vision was gone. Only his own reflection remained. Daniel never told anyone what he had truly found beneath the sands. The city was still there, sleeping or waiting, and he had no illusions about the part he had played in disturbing it. Some discoveries were not meant to be shared. He left the rotunda in silence, locking the doors behind him. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying with it a whisper he almost understood. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.